Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is basically a compendium of 5 years of Death Valley trips that we've been doing. So this is the overall location of Death Valley. It's in Death Valley National Park is located on the California-Nevada border, about 2 hours from Las Vegas. It's the largest national park in the lower 48 states. It covers 5,200 square miles. Many of you know Cheryl Soshnick, a rover who was very active in the 1970s. And many years ago, she moved to Park City, Utah, and joined the Wasatch Mountain Club, which is an outing club that's similar to Rovers. In 2016, she invited me to join their annual Death Valley Escape, which she's been running for about 15 years. And that year, the participants included the Wasatch Mountain Club people, as well as 8 current and former Rover members. After participating in that for 2 years, in 2017, I gave a brief trip report at a Rover meeting, and that garnered so much interest that I proposed to Cheryl that we should do a joint trip in 2018. So this is a car camping trip, and our base of operations is the Furnace Creek Campground, which is adjacent to the main visitor center, and it's about 100 feet below sea level. To get there, we typically fly into Las Vegas, we rent cars, and we drive about 2 hours to the park, stopping to pick up our groceries and other supplies for the week. Each year at the beginning of August, we reserve the campsites for the following February to make sure that we get the best ones. And of course, the best ones are these really nice ones on the one edge of the campground underneath the tamarisk trees. As you can see, it's quite a nice campground. It's got spaces with picnic tables, fire rings, and lots of spaces to put your tents. And also very nice sunsets. The Wasatch Club people usually drive from Utah so that they can haul all the amenities with them, including big stoves and things. In the past, they've actually brought loaner equipment for us that we didn't have room for, like large coolers and things that we could borrow for the week. So that was really nice of them. The Rover trip size is usually 12 to 16 people. That's 4 campsites, 4 or 5 cars. We do break up into smaller groups for the day trips. And for those people who are new to Death Valley, I always organize trips to visit some of the iconic sites in the park. Death Valley is a land of extremes, spanning an area of about 140 miles long and 50 miles wide. Telescope Peak is the highest point in the park at 11,300 feet. It's less than 20 miles from the lowest point, Badwater Basin, which is at 282 feet below sea level. The stretching of the Earth's crust due to plate tectonics formed Death Valley about 2 million years ago. And if you look at the map, the area in green is almost all below sea level. Death Valley also has the distinction of being the lowest, driest, and hottest point in North America. In July of 1913, it set the record as the hottest place on Earth with an air temperature of 134 degrees Fahrenheit. This is why we go in February and not in July. Of course, they take their heat warnings very seriously there. It can be very dangerous in the summer, but in February, it's quite pleasant. Highs typically range from the low 80s during the day to the 40s at night. Distances in the park are extremely deceiving. Standing here on the edge of the valley floor, it looks like the other side is only a few miles away. In actuality, it's over 10 miles to the base of the opposite alluvial fan. These salt flats were formed at the end of the last ice age from glacial Lake Manly, which was over 600 feet deep back then. Here we are at a ranger talk at Badwater Basin, which, as I said, is 282 feet below sea level. It's the lowest point in North America. And the ranger has organized the tall and short people to represent the valleys and mountain ranges to the west of the park to explain why Death Valley is so dry. Most of the weather comes from the Pacific side, west to east, and the mountains to the west capture all the rain before it gets to Death Valley. And if you look across the road, you can see the tiny little sea level sign up there 280 feet above your head. In the mountains directly above Badwater is a viewpoint called Dante's View. From here, you can see a good part of southern Death Valley. From Dante's View, you can see down into the basin to the salt flats and the brine pools. And one of the amazing things I learned from the ranger talk is that the erosion is slowly filling up the valley, and that the actual bedrock is about 9,000 feet below the surface, so that the depth of the sediment is almost as high as the peaks in the mountains. The Devil's Golf Course is just north of Badwater. Here you have a similar salt layer as you do at Badwater, but here it's mixed with clay, and when it rains, the salt will dissolve, and then it will slowly precipitate out again as the water dries up after a rain, and you end up with a lot of razor sharp spikes. So it's basically pretty much impossible to walk through this area. A half-hour drive north of our campsite are the Mesquite Flat sand dunes. Because they're surrounded by high mountains on all sides, the dunes are trapped here in the center of the valley, but they constantly move around as the prevailing winds change from season to season. Park rangers give nighttime tours of the dunes where you can learn about the tracks of the various animals that live there. The racetrack is a small isolated valley at the far northern end of the park. For many years, it was one of the great mysteries of Death Valley, having dozens of large rocks that seemingly moved of their own volition, leaving tracks behind them. The racetrack is dead flat, and the surface is composed of a mixture of fine clay and salt. The prevailing theory was that under certain conditions of rainy weather and high winds, the surface becomes extremely slippery and the wind moves the stones. This was recently confirmed by researchers using time-lapse photos and rocks tagged with GPS trackers. The geology of Death Valley is somewhat complicated, as you can see from this map, but this also makes it a geologist's paradise. Mosaic Canyon is a prime example. About 500 million years ago, this was the bottom of a shallow sea, and billions of sea creatures lived and died here, and their shells sank to the bottom. Over millions of years, the layer of shells was buried under miles of sediment, and heat and pressure and minerals turned it first into dolomite and then into marble. The area then uplifted and the layers above eroded away, exposing the marble layer. The top layer of marble was eroded and broken into chunks, which washed downward and mixed with other sediment. Then the area was buried in sediment again and compressed again. Finally, the area was uplifted a second time and eroded into washes and gullies with these natural mosaics along the wall. The marble chunks are similar in hardness to the material that they're embedded in, and so the mosaics are relatively flat and smooth. The lower level of the marble layer is still intact, and you walk up through it as you go up the canyon. Just about any geologic process you can imagine is represented somewhere in Death Valley. This is the Ubehebe crater at the north end of the valley. The crater is half a mile wide and 770 feet deep. A few thousand years ago, magma rose close to the surface, then encountered groundwater, which caused a massive steam explosion, blowing material out of the crater. This type of volcanism is called a maar eruption, and it involves relatively little lava flow. The orange rock on the crater walls is actually much older bedrock rather than lava or ash, so that's the bedrock that the explosion blew up through. There is a trail that runs down to the bottom of the main crater, and here's a picture of Gary at the bottom. The trail runs all the way around the rim of the main crater and also to the nearby Little Hebe crater. This is actually a complex of 14 different craters that are over this whole area, but these are the best preserved ones. The Little Hebe crater is the main source for these layered beds of volcanic ash. The artist palette is another feature created by volcanism. These are beds of volcanic ash that are eroding and weathering, revealing colors caused by various minerals. And again, this is close to Badwater, and it's reached by a winding loop road off the main Badwater Road. There's a spot where you can park and a trail up to the mineral beds. Once you've seen the major sites, there are literally hundreds of other canyons to explore. This is Titus Canyon, which has a one-way road that starts near the Rhyolite ghost town and winds down into the valley. The natural bridge is just off the main road near Badwater. These are erosion features on the walls of the canyon. They're made by, they're basically potholes like the ones up at Taylor's Falls, created by rocks drilling their way down, and then the side of the hole eroded away, leaving a half a pothole. Golden Canyon is close to the campground, and park rangers lead interpretive hikes there on a regular basis. Most canyons in Death Valley are narrow, twisting, dead-end slot canyons that end in dry waterfalls. Some have multiple small waterfalls that you can scramble over. Others require a bit of technical climbing. Golden Canyon is one of the few where you can actually walk out of the top end of the canyon and end up at the Zabriskie Point viewpoint. Although Death Valley is the driest place in North America, there are multiple water sources in the form of springs around the edges of the valley. Today we're heading for Darwin Falls in the far west of the park near the small town of Panamint Springs. It's an hour or so drive through some pretty spectacular scenery. We go across the Panamint Valley as well as crossing Death Valley itself. From the trailhead, it's a 2-mile hike up the wash and along a small creek. At the end of our expedition, we take a well-earned break at the brew pub in Panamint Springs. South of Badwater Basin, Willow Canyon also has a small stream. And a waterfall that feeds into it. By far the largest water source is Texas Springs, which supports the campgrounds, the Death Valley Resort with its golf course, date palms, and duck pond, as well as a luxury hotel with gardens and water features. A flow rate of over 2 million gallons a day allows for the existence of multiple swimming pools. Despite being a desert, Death Valley does get about 2.2 inches of rain a year, most of it in February. In 2019, a group of us visited the Ubehebe crater, braving gale-force winds to hike around the area while the storm moved in. This is what we saw on the road on our way back. When we got back to our camp, we found that those nice flat areas behind the trees are also the lowest area of the campground. A few people got flooded out and ended up getting a room at the resort so they could dry out their belongings. Gary was a bit luckier. He had piled valuable, vulnerable items on top of his sleeping pad and had the bottom of his tent was almost completely waterproof. So really nothing got wet, and we were able to rescue his stuff from the tent so that he could move the tent when he got back. Eventually, all storms come to an end, and everyone survived in good spirits. The valley looks extremely barren most of the time, with small clumps of desert holly, mesquite, and creosote bush adorning the alluvial fans. But every 5 to 7 years, Death Valley has a super bloom. This is caused by higher than average rainfall in the late fall, followed by a bit more rain in January. The entire valley will be filled with these Panamint daisies that seemingly spring up from nowhere. Dozens of other wildflowers bloom at the same time. Death Valley is home to a number of different animals, all of them adapted to the harsh climate. Various lizards are common in the canyons. They're fairly skittish, so you need to move quickly and quietly if you want a good picture. Ravens are fairly common as well. And grackles, especially around the campgrounds. This little guy was not skittish at all. He came right up to our picnic table and started scarfing down dry spaghetti strands that had been spilled during our dinner process. All right, for some reason, now this is actually a video of the kangaroo rat, but it doesn't seem to be working here, unfortunately. Barry set up his trail cam one night and captured a number of other visitors to the campsite. And let's see now. I don't know why this isn't working, but at any rate, we had another visit from the kangaroo rat, and also a desert kit fox and a rabbit. Returning from our expedition to Darwin Falls, we stopped at a cafe in Panamint Springs. Their sign was not false advertising. There actually was a roadrunner that lived nearby and visited the patio to forage for snacks. And of course, where there are roadrunners, there are coyotes not too far behind. If you head up into the canyons at higher elevations, you may catch a glimpse of mountain goats. Amazingly enough, there are even fish in Death Valley. Our intrepid explorers are at Salt Creek, just a few miles north of the campground, looking for the elusive desert pupfish. I don't think I've ever actually seen one there, but this is what they look like if you find them. Small bands of the Timbisha Shoshone people have lived in Death Valley for over 1,000 years. The population began to increase in the 1850s as prospectors on their way to California gold fields discovered gold, silver, and other minerals in and around Death Valley. This is the famous Harmony Borax Works just north of the Furnace Creek campground. Borax minerals were scraped off the surface of the nearby salt flats, partially purified, and then loaded into the 20 mule team wagons for transport to the railhead at Mojave. The Keene Wonder Mine was discovered in the Funeral Mountains during a local gold rush in the early 1900s. It's a few miles drive up a dirt road to the remains of the processing buildings at the mouth of a canyon. From there, you can hike up a trail to the actual mine shafts. And if you look back, you can see quite a nice view over the northern part of the Death Valley. Bits and pieces of the original mining equipment still remain, like these pipes that brought water from a spring down to the processing mill. The gold ore was brought down to the mill on an aerial tramway supported by these timber pylons. Hundreds of mine shafts and pits exist all over the valley, but most of them are closed off with open gratings to protect tourists, but also to protect the bats that live in many of them. The first 20 feet or so of this one is accessible, so you can see what the mines were like. With all the mining going on in the area, there was a demand for timber for construction and charcoal for smelting the ores. These beehive kilns high up in the Panamint Range were built to produce charcoal from the local wood. I think they were in business for about 10 years or so in the 1880s. Of course, once you have a mining boom that starts, people need other services in the area, giving rise to boom towns like Rhyolite, Nevada, shown here in 1909. It had outfitters for prospectors, a land office, a bank, and a hotel, and even a fancy train station with a ballroom on the second floor. The train station is pretty much the only intact building left. Just because it's a ghost town doesn't mean there aren't a few live souls around, including an artist who makes these life-size fiberglass sculptures that look a lot like the Dementors from Harry Potter. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks very much, Bob. That was a great presentation, and I really enjoyed the trips with you.
The photos were stunning. All of them were just amazing photos.
Oh, thank you. Well, they weren't all mine. I did get several good photos from other trip members, and for stuff that I didn't have, I pulled a few things off the web as well.
Is this a trip that you would plan? Like, is this a trip that'll appear once trips open up? Like, will there be another of these trips in the future?
I think so. There's probably enough interest. We've done 3 of them as rover trips so far. The last one was 2020. We got the last one in just before COVID struck. And typically I announce them in July, because so we need to line up volunteers to grab those campsites as soon as they become available at the beginning of August. So assuming that there's interest, I will probably schedule another one for 2022.
I'll do it, Bob.
Me too, me too.
Okay.
Cut me up.
There'll be a fight. There'll be a feeding frenzy.
How long is the trip usually from start to finish?
Oh, it's usually a week long. So like typically a Sunday through Saturday. So we'll fly in on a Saturday or a Sunday and fly out the following Saturday. Although in past years, a smaller subset of us have actually spent an extra few days in Valley of Fire State Park, which is about an hour from Las Vegas in the other direction. It's also a very interesting desert park.
Hey, Bob.
Thank
What
you.
were that last slide you showed? It's like it was like salt figures or something. Looks like ghosts. Like,
Oh yeah, those are. So there's this guy in the Rhyolite ghost town. He's got a little shop there where he sells, souvenirs and minerals, but he's also an artist, and he does these. Those ghost sculptures are basically life size, and they're made out of fiberglass.
okay.
And he's got a bunch of other weird stuff there too. Very
Oh,
strange
sure.
looking sculptures of various sorts.
Did you get up at Scotty's Castle at all, Bob?
Scotty's Castle, I have been there a long time ago. I used to go out to Nevada fairly frequently because my parents lived in Las Vegas. So I would get out there once a year, and sometimes we would all go out to Death Valley for a few days. But Scotty's Castle has actually been closed for the last several years. There was a flood which wiped out the road. It wiped out a bunch of outbuildings. Fortunately, it didn't damage Scotty's Castle at all, but all the supporting outbuildings, the generator buildings and stuff were trashed, and the road was completely washed out And so it's, I think, they've been working on it for years now, so it should reopen again at some point. But that's well worth seeing if they ever do reopen it. Worth the
They
trip up
also
there.
have a really good visitor center there with the
Yeah, in fact, the campground, that's another big advantage of camping at Furnace Creek. We're right next to the main visitor center, and they have an excellent museum there, with the natural history and the native peoples and all that sort of stuff. And also the resort right next door also has a really good mining equipment museum. They've got an indoor chunk with a bunch of mineral specimens and pictures from the old mines and that sort of thing. And they have a big outdoor area that covers, I don't know, an acre or two that's covered with old traction engines and steam engines and mining equipment and wagons of various sorts. And the other big advantage is that since it's a large park, gets a lot of use, there are ranger programs. Usually, even in February, which is kind of a slack season, there are half a dozen ranger tours that they take you out to Golden Canyon or Badwater Basin or the sand dunes and, tell you a lot of interesting stuff about that.
In 2020, there was a star party that they did we walked a couple of miles to take part in. And the visibility there is extraordinary because there is nothing else. There's no light pollution in Death Valley. So that was a good thing.
Keep going in and out.
That's right. It's one of the darkest sky, considering how close it is to Las Vegas and to Bishop and Los Angeles and everything. It's one of the darkest skies in the country there because the big mountains around it.
Bob, someone was asking if showers were available there.
Yes, sort of. So the deal is if there's a very nice restroom there with actually has running water and flush toilets and everything, and a cleaning station for where you can wash your dishes and everything. But in order to get a shower, you basically have to go over to the resort and walk over to their swimming pool. And if you want to be honest, you can go to the office and buy a pass for $10 or whatever. But most of us just kind of sneak in and use the showers. Nobody seems to care much. I should talk a little bit about the costs as well, since this is actually a relatively cheap trip. The basic trip costs for the camping and food and car rental and so forth run about $200 or so for the week. And on top of that, you have your airfare, which is usually fairly cheap into Las Vegas because there's a lot of competition on that route. So typically you'd spend $500 for this trip for a week.
Bob, great program, and thank you so much for leading these trips for years now. One other thing that you can do there is the Wasatch Mountain people are big bikers, and I actually brought a bike along last year and did a 38-mile bike trip with them.
Is that mountain biking or is it road biking or?
Road biking.
Oh, no.
But mountain biking would potentially be available too, although the rock's really pretty sharp.
Yeah, that is one issue there. Over the years, we've had 3 or 4 flat tires because of the main roads are fine. They're all nice, well maintained and paved and everything, but a lot of these interesting places require going off the main road onto a dirt or gravel road for a couple of miles to get from the main road to the parking area, like Titus Canyon or Golden Canyon. Well, the Golden Canyon's pretty close, but Mosaic Canyon, you have to drive up. And Darwin Falls, I think you had to drive in a few miles on a dirt road, and there are a lot of sharp rocks. So,
Hey, Bob, this is Jane. I have a question.
yeah.
I've moved to a hammock. Is the campground able to accommodate a hammock, or would I need to bring a tent and sleep on the ground?
I think the trees behind the campsites that we usually get are large enough to support a hammock. I think that would probably work.
Okay, thanks.
You know, and are you still doing this with the Wasatch people? So they are still sharing gear with us?
Yeah, we time it to coordinate with them. They typically do it the second week of February every year.
Okay.
Which does tend to conflict with the Bayfield rover trip, but that's the way it goes. But yeah, they're really a great bunch of people, and they have, they all have like big trucks, and some of them bring RVs and things like that, and they bring these huge 2 and 3 burner camp stoves and all sorts of equipment. One of their guys is a specialist in Dutch oven cooking.
Ooh.
And they actually loaned us a couple of Dutch ovens so that we could make a Dutch oven dinner one night in our group. Oh yes, and every day in the afternoon when everybody comes back from their excursions of the day, we have a cocktail hour. Which is kind of a potluck cocktail hour with various drinks and any kind of munchies that you want to bring, and that just everybody sits around and talks about what they saw that day and good places to go, and it's a great bunch of folks. And they were, like I say, the last time, one of the big problems that we have there flying in it is that you need coolers for your food. So because you have to keep the animals out and you have to keep your stuff cool, and ice is available there. But in the past, we used those cheapo styrofoam coolers and then threw them away at the end of the trip. But this last trip, the Wasatch people actually volunteered to bring a bunch of their spare coolers. So I think they brought like 4 coolers, maybe something like that.
Oh, that was nice.
And that we got to use for the week.
And they make coffee every morning.
That's right. Yep. They get up before dawn and make huge. They have some of those giant coffee pots like the ones we have, the really big ones we have in the equipment locker, and they fire up the stoves and make a huge vat of coffee. And it is a good idea to get up at around dawn, which isn't that early, because it's February, so you're getting up at like 8 a.m. But if it's its normal temperatures, it gets pretty warm in the middle of the day. It gets up into the 80s. So you want to actually start, if you're hiking up canyons and things, you want to start out earlier in the morning so that you're not out there at the hottest part of the day, because in some of the canyons, the sun will just kind of get amplified by the canyon walls.
So we must be borrowing stoves and stuff from them also. Besides,
well, we bring the little cartridge stoves.
Oh, okay.
So we usually bring 2 or 3 of those, and I bring some.
Okay.
Some, because we don't have as large a group, so we have several people who bring like small. I have some, 3-quart folding pots and things like that. And the last one, actually, Gary drove his big truck down, so he brought a bunch of the rover gear, the giant cook pots and things like that. But usually we make do with the smaller, with multiple smaller pots instead of one big one.
Okay. It looks like a beautiful place to go visit. It just something to look forward to for next spring.
Well, it is. I mean, there's more than you can see there. Going back every year, there's still new stuff to see. So.
And do you
how long are the hikes that you go on? I mean, are they for intermediate or advanced, or is there anything to
It really
do?
depends. It depends on where you're going. Most of them aren't that far, and a lot of them are out and back. So you can, some people will hike 5 miles out and back, and others will just hike a couple miles and then back to the car. And a lot of them are relatively flat, not terribly strenuous. Some of them are quite strenuous. It just depends on how far you want to go. But you do need good hiking boots because you're on sharp rock and scrabbling around dry waterfalls and things in a lot of the places you go.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Anyone?
Did you, I was holding this question, but did they give any indication of how people survive there? Like the Indians year round, or, when you're out?
Oh, well, the
heat, I guess.
The natives, the Native Americans who lived there, the Timbisha Shoshone tribe, or they were a relatively small group. I think there's only about 300 members now, but they traditionally would live during the winter. They would have a small settlement down in the valley now, and now they still actually have that land as a reservation. It's right near the visitor center, actually. But they also, during the summer, of course, it's too hot and there's not enough water to live down there on the valley floor, and they would migrate to other camping areas up in the mountains at higher elevations where it's much cooler. And there's also a lot more food up there because there's trees and there's animals and there's birds and there's wild seeds and things you can collect and animals you can hunt.
Yeah, I almost forgot there's actually downhill skiing. Some of those areas out there, aren't there? Yeah, so it must get cool in the winter, or in this anyway. They're higher elevations anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you noticed in the at Badwater Basin, you're looking up towards Telescope Peak, and there's snow on the mountains up there. And there's actually snow, small amounts of snow up at those charcoal kilns up at Wild Rose. Those beehive kilns, there was snow and ice on the ground there as well.
The visitor centers too had really good information and videos about the history and the geography and so forth of the area. That was a good place to sit and watch a movie when it was raining out. I think they had more rain. I was at 2019, and I think they had more rain that one day than they had typically all year long.
That's right. They actually got their entire year's worth of rain and more in one day. That was the day we got flooded out. Yeah. And that's actually happened before. The Wasatch Mountain Club people have been going there for about 20 some years now. And they've been flooded out a couple of times before that.
Yeah, there was a rover trip in the 90s, and that was one of the rare years where they got a lot of rain, and they got kind of rained out there that year. Yeah, I'm not sure it was in the 90s.
So Bob, how far would people hike every day approximately?
Well, it just kind of depends on where you are and how strenuous it is. We'd most of the main sites you can see only take a couple of miles of hiking, a couple miles in and a couple miles back. A lot of the more iconic sites will have parking areas right near the mouth of the canyon or whatever. So you can just drive up the dirt road to the parking area and hike up the canyon. some of the more obscure places don't have roads to them, so you actually have to slog up the alluvial fan for a couple of miles before you even get to the mouth of the canyon. For example, that Willow Creek, that Willow Canyon with the waterfall, that was a case where the parking area was close to the main road, and then you had to slog in up the fan, and then you get to the mouth of the canyon and go in another mile from there to get to the waterfalls or other interesting things.
How long did it?
We also split into small groups too. I think we had 4 or 5 cars, so we could split up and people could go to different spots and hike what they were interested in. So it was really flexible.
Bob, how long would it take that rainfall to dry up so you could go back in your tents?
Oh, I think the flooding was pretty much gone by the next day. And it was just, in that case, it was just in the low-lying areas, you know, like the tents that were pitched up on the higher ground, like under the trees, they didn't get as wet. So like I never had to take my tent down. I actually moved mine in the morning because we got a little bit of rain overnight, and there was like this little trickle that went under one corner of my tent when I was parked down on the flat part there. I decided, well, let's not risk it, you know, so I just picked up my tent and moved it up under the trees where it was a little higher. But I guess there have been cases in the past before we started going there where the entire campground had to be evacuated. There was that much rain that they had to basically move everybody out because it was a couple of feet deep and covered the whole campground at that point.
Was there a lot of wind in the valley?
Yes, the valley floor isn't too bad, but you can get gusty winds, you know, 20, 30 miles an hour. The day of the rainstorm, we were up at the Ubehebe crater, which is notorious for winds even under good conditions, and that was definitely gale force winds. It was like 50 miles an hour, and you know, there were bits of gravel being blown at you by the wind as well as the rain, and you could barely stand up against it. But despite that, Gary and Barry went down into the crater. And as I recall, they said it was fairly windy most of the way down until you got to the bottom of the crater.
So I was going to ask, and maybe you've already answered it, but what were some of the greater challenges of the trip, other than being pelted by rocks?
Well, I would say, you know, this trip is an intermediate level trip for the most part. It's not real challenging unless you want to go out. Some people have gone out with the diehards in the Wasatch Mountain group, you know, who go out and do 50-mile round trip bike rides with a 3,000-foot climb. Some of them go up the canyon and do a little bit of technical canyoneering to get up over some of the waterfalls with they bring along a few ropes and things like that. But for the most part, the hardest part really is on some of the canyons you might want to see. Like I say, you actually have to spend an hour or so actually just slogging up the slope on the alluvial fan just to get to the mouth of the canyon before you can even get into the interesting area. So
I think the biggest challenge to me was flying out and taking a tent and an air mattress and everything you need to be comfortable and food and everything like that on a plane, because it's like backpacking, but you know, you're
not used to that yet.
You gotta get out. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. We tried different things, different size tents, because we went a couple of times, and different size air mattresses, and yeah, it's a challenge. How many bags do you want to check, right?
And how many people fit into a car?
You're kind of limited into what you can. So it is very much like backpacking. You're kind of limited into how much you can take.
and you can't bring the fuel.
Two questions, Bob. Was water hard to come by? Was that a problem?
No, water was not a problem because the campground is fed by that Texas spring. In fact, there's 3 large campgrounds there. There's the Furnace Creek campground where we were that has tents, and there's 2 other large RV parks just on the other side of the road, basically, and they're all fed by that Texas spring, which produces 2 million gallons of good water a day. So basically you've got as much water, but that does bring up a point. You do need to carry water with you when you're out in the hiking. You should carry a minimum of 2 liters, they recommend.
Great program, Bob. You did a great job. You really covered it all. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
We gotta get going. So we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob, if I wanted to go but didn't really have a particular interest in camping, is there one central spot that would make a good resting place to go out and do day trips one after another?
Well, you're talking about like going to a motel or something, or?
Right, civilized living.
Okay, well, the big problem with that is that the resort there is very, very expensive. I think the rooms, the people who got flooded out, I think they were paying like $240 a night for a room, something like, is that right, Sue?
Yes, yeah, it was $240, $250 a night.
Yeah, and the hotel is even more expensive.
Well, you can afford that, Ken.
But it might actually be, you have to look into it, but it might actually be cheaper to like rent a small RV in Las Vegas and use that as your, as your base. Because otherwise, the cheap motels are in Pahrump, which is about an hour away. So you'd have to, you'd stay in a motel or something in Pahrump and then drive an hour or more each way to get to Furnace Creek, and then you'd have to drive another hour to get, or more, to get to some of the sites. Like it's a 2-hour trip up to the Yuba Hibi crater, basically. So you really do want to be in Furnace Creek if you can arrange it.
It might be better to pay extra baggage on the plane and just bring all sorts of things to make yourself comfortable, like pack a camp bed or a extra nice air mattress or something like that, and pay the extra baggage. Because otherwise, yeah, there's nothing real close except what's really expensive.
But you do have to figure out what can fit into the vehicle too.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah. So if you rent your own car and pay the extra, yeah.
Did most people fly into Las Vegas?
Yes, we all did, basically, except for one trip when Gary Carlson actually was going to a conference or something in Las Vegas at around the same time. So he actually drove his big truck from Minneapolis down to Las Vegas.
So if Gary's driving out, you could load his truck up with all sorts of stuff that he could bring for you.
How far is Las Vegas from your campsite?
It's about a 2-hour.
90 miles.
Yeah, it's about 2 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you flew. I never really figured it out, Bob, but if you flew into California, where you'd fly into and how far it would probably be further than Vegas, right?
Oh, it is. Yeah, yeah, it's really, Las Vegas is by far the closest airport that you can get to.
Yeah, it is a very unique place. And something I wanted to add too is that overlook on the way out, and I don't remember what it's called now. They had a sign there that I remember reading that there's some like underground river that goes through the salt flats there that flows from one point to another. So there's a lot of water, and I think you've mentioned this before, Bob, there's a lot of water underground, which is where they get all the water for the campsite. So there's a lot of water underground, but on the surface, it's very, very dry.
Yeah.
That's in geology.
Did the tent peg stay in the high wind?
Didn't really have any trouble with that. Yeah, because the ground is very, it's actually excellent tenting ground because it's relatively easy to drive in the stakes, but they hold really, really well because it's like a fairly dense clay, sand and clay type of composition.
I camped there in the middle 80s with a group of college students on the Furnace Creek ground. There's an area in there where the hills kind of come close together and it forms a perfect Venturi nozzle. And the people that were tenting there came back and their tents were way up in the valley.
The wind, yeah, you can get some pretty stiff winds there at times.
You know, all the gear was still in the tent.
That's another reason why we like the sites under the tree, protected from the wind there too. The other thing you get there at the campsite is usually most nights you get serenaded by a group of coyotes howling off in the distance.
Yep.
A few years ago when Barry told me he was going to Death Valley, I thought to myself, why would anybody do that? Now I see why.
It is a pretty amazing place.
Yeah, I loved your description on the website, Bob. Yeah, everything's very negative there, like, you know, Devil's Golf Course, Death Valley, and what was it, Funeral Mountains, and
yep,
a lot of stuff there. Yeah,
it's kind of a theme.
Yeah. Any other questions?